Picture 1944 when delegates from 44 Allied nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Inside that room, they were about to make a decision shaping the global economy for the next 80 years, and Britain, the world's financial superpower for over 2 centuries, stood broke with national debt soaring to 249% of GDP. 2 devastating world wars had financially exhausted the empire that once ruled the seas, and everyone in that hall knew it. So they did something that has only happened a few times in history, transferring global reserve currency status from one empire to another, from the British pound to the American dollar. But this wasn't just a financial handover, because it was the continuation of a pattern repeating itself for more than 5 centuries. A predictable cycle of rise and peak and overextension and collapse. Every world reserve currency has followed this same life cycle. And today the US dollar shows the same warning signs that preceded every 4 before it. Understanding what's coming requires going back to where this pattern began. Portugal opens the age of discovery. 1450 brought the Portuguese real as the world's first true reserve currency. And for about 80 years, Portugal dominated global trade. Luck had nothing to do with it because Portugal revolutionized navigation and global commerce by charting new sea routes to Africa and Asia and the Americas. The fall of Constantinople to the Ottomans in 1453 blocked the old spice routes with hostile powers, so Portugal found a way around by literally sailing around Africa and opening a new age of discovery. Lisbon became the center of the trading world, where the Portuguese real was accepted across continents from Europe to Asia. Portugal's empire stretched across Africa and India and Malaysia and Japan, and even into China through Macau at its peak. But success always leads to overreach. Maintaining military outposts on 4 continents drained Portugal's treasury, while competition from the Dutch and British and French grew fierce. Then a royal succession crisis in the 1530s destabilized the kingdom, and by 1580, Spain absorbed Portugal into the Iberian Union. 80 years the Portuguese real had ruled world trade before it was gone, replaced by Spanish silver. Spain floods the world with silver. Spanish rise began with the discovery of the richest silver deposit in the world, the mountain of Potosi, high in the Bolivian Andes, discovered in 1545. Nearly half the world's silver came from this single mountain between 1575 and 1635, and the Spanish minted their pieces of 8 in Potosi's mint, marked with the letter P. These coins became the first truly global currency. The Spanish dollar became the most stable and trusted coin in the Western world from the 16th to the 19th century, even serving as legal tender in the United States until 1857. Roughly 110 years, Spain's dominance lasted from the 1530s to the 1640s, but then the familiar pattern appeared again through overextension and crushing debt. Charles I left his son Philip II a mountain of debt totaling 36 million ducats, with an annual deficit of another million, and Philip II defaulted on Spain's loans 4 separate times in 1557 and 1560 and 1575 and 1596. Massive inflation came from the endless flow of New World silver. Prices in Spain quadrupled during his reign, and when the silver supply dropped by half under Philip III, Spain's economy crumbled, and bankruptcy followed again in 1607. The Iberian Union fell apart by 1641, and Spain's monetary dominance ended as a new financial power rose, the Dutch Republic. Before we continue, though, something needs saying. This pattern of reserve currency cycles, understanding how entire empires collapse not from military conquest, but from financial overextension, this diverges sharply from what you learned in economics class. Real wealth preservation requires understanding these cycles, so hit that subscribe button because it helps the channel, and these historical patterns need exposing before they repeat. Drop a comment too, because I genuinely want knowing which currency you think comes next. Amsterdam invents modern finance. The 1600s turned Amsterdam into the world's leading financial hub, where the Dutch guilder, backed by innovation and trade, emerged as Europe's de facto reserve currency. The Bank of Amsterdam introduced efficient, trustworthy systems for international payments, while Dutch merchants and investors pioneered modern finance itself. They created the world's first stock exchange, and marine insurance, and new instruments like acceptance credit and publicly traded company shares. From From 1642 to 1720, roughly 78 years, the Dutch guilder dominated world trade accounting for more than a third of all international transactions. But even the Dutch fell into the same trap. Military overreach, especially during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War from 1780 to 1784, bankrupted the country as the Dutch East India Company collapsed under the strain of its conflicts with the British. Britain had risen to take its place by the late 1700s. Britain's two-century reign. The pound sterling, backed by industrial power and a vast colonial empire, became the next global reserve currency. For over 2 centuries from the 1720s to 1944, it ruled world trade longer than any currency in modern history, and at the height of British dominance, over 60% of world trade was invoiced in pounds. London served as the global hub for insurance and commodities and investment. The gold standard further strengthened the pound's supremacy, and after the Great Recoinage of 1816, Britain's currency was considered the most stable on Earth. By 1922, the British Empire controlled 458 million people, 1/5 of the world's population and a quarter of its land mass, and Britain's financial power seemed unbreakable. Then came the familiar decline. World War I exploded Britain's national debt from $650 million in 1914 to over $7 billion by 1919. The Second World War was even more catastrophic because by 1945, government debt reached 270% of GDP, and Britain had won the war but lost its financial crown. Bretton Woods transfers the crown. July 1st through July 22nd, 1944, brought over 700 delegates from 44 allied nations gathering to rebuild the global financial system. Their agreement created the International Monetary Fund and the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, what we now know as the World Bank. The Bretton Woods system tied every major currency to the US dollar and the dollar itself to gold at $35 per ounce, making the transition from pound to dollar official. For the next quarter century, the US dollar reigned supreme until 1971 when President Richard Nixon suspended the dollar's convertibility into gold. The gold standard was gone, but the dollar didn't collapse because instead it found a new anchor: oil. After the 1973 OPEC oil crisis, the U.S. struck a strategic deal with Saudi Arabia, where in exchange for American military protection, Saudi oil would be priced and sold exclusively in U.S. dollars. By 1975, every OPEC member had agreed to do the same, and thus the petrodollar system was born. Because every country needed oil, every country needed dollars. This artificial global demand allowed the U.S. to run massive deficits that would have crushed any other nation's currency. Dollar dominance was unquestioned for decades. At its peak in 2000, over 70% of the world's foreign exchange reserves were held in U.S. dollars. But now the numbers are shifting. The 4-stage cycle that never fails. Every reserve currency has passed through 4 stages: rise and peak and overextension and collapse. Stage 1 brings rise where a nation gains dominance through innovation, either in trade or finance or military strength. Portugal mastered global navigation while Spain flooded the world with silver. The Dutch built modern finance. Britain's Industrial Revolution reshaped global trade, and America rose through post-war industrial might. Stage 2 brings peak, where the reserve currency becomes nearly universal and gets used in over 60% of global transactions, and the empire seems untouchable. Stage 3 brings overextension, where the cracks appear through massive military costs and spiraling debt and waning productivity. Portugal stretched across 4 continents, Spain defaulted repeatedly, the Dutch bankrupted themselves fighting Britain, and Britain's debt hit 270% of GDP after the World Wars. The US today carries debt at 124% of GDP and has spent $8 trillion on Middle East wars alone. Stage 4 brings collapse, where the reserve currency loses trust and power shifts elsewhere, and every empire has faced this reckoning. What history teaches about transitions. Portugal never regained its influence after Spain's conquest in 1580. Spain, despite immense wealth from the Americas, fell into centuries of decline. The Netherlands remained prosperous but shrank to a regional power, and Britain, though still wealthy, saw its empire dissolve and its global dominance fade after 1945. The 1950s still held 55% of global reserves in sterling, but within 2 decades that share had dropped sharply. Britain's century ended and the American century began. But transitions like this don't happen overnight because Britain's decline took decades, and the US overtook Britain economically long before the dollar replaced the pound as the dominant currency. The same slow shift may be happening again, this time with China and the emerging multipolar world. Every reserve currency's lifespan has averaged around 95 years, and the US dollar is now 81 years into its run. The signs are all too familiar. Declining global share from 70% to 58%, shrinking foreign treasury demand, BRICS alternatives rising, petrodollar agreements fading, and an overextended military presence with 900 bases in 130 countries. The pattern defining 5 centuries of economic history is repeating, and the only question left is how fast the transition will unfold and who will lead the next financial era. Will it be gradual like Britain's slow descent, or sudden like the Dutch collapse? Will a single new power emerge, or will the future be multipolar with several reserve currencies sharing global influence? History doesn't repeat itself perfectly, but it rhymes. And if the rhyme holds true, we're nearing the final verses of the dollar's dominance. Thanks for watching. Here's what I want knowing from you, though. Do you think the dollar will fade gradually over decades like Britain's pound did? Or will we see a sudden collapse triggered by a specific crisis? That question determines whether you have time to prepare or whether the transition catches everyone by surprise. So drop your take in the comments because I genuinely want hearing how you're positioning for what comes next. If you found this video insightful, hit that like and subscribe button and share it with someone who's curious about how money and power and history always seem to move in cycles.